By sundown, the bitter winds of the plains cut through Jack Boone's coat like a blade. The prairie, once wide and welcoming, had turned cruel. He hadn't planned on stopping for the night, but the storm had a different idea. The blizzard swept across the land without warning, catching Jack in its furious grasp. The temperature plummeted faster than he could think, and within moments, the familiar horizon disappeared beneath a swirling veil of snow. The wind howled relentlessly, a sharp, biting cold that cut to the bone. Jack's breath came in short bursts, freezing almost as soon as it hit the air. His gloves were worn thin, his scarf tangled against his face, but even those meager protections couldn't stop the cold from creeping into his bones. He pulled his coat tighter, squinting through the blinding snow, but it was no use. The storm was upon him, and there was no escaping its fury. Jack glanced around, hoping for some sign of shelter. There was nothing. Just an endless stretch of flat land, no hills, no trees, just the open, frozen plains. He'd known better than to travel too far without a plan, but the storm had come too quickly. His instinct told him to keep moving, to push through and make it to the next settlement or even the next water hole. But the storm had made that impossible. There would be no reaching safety before the night set in. He scanned the horizon once. More, the wind biting at his exposed skin. And then, there it was, a slight rise in the land, barely visible through the storm, but enough to break the wind. It wasn't much, just a small bump in the earth, but it could be enough. He had no choice. He had to stop. Jack urged his horse forward, urging the animal against the wind as it slowly trudged toward the rise. The cold seeped through his layers, and his muscles ached with the strain. He dismounted quickly, the snow swirling around his boots, and tugged his pack free from the saddle. There was no time to waste. The storm wasn't going to wait for him to be ready. As he started to build, Jack worked quickly, the cold numbing his fingers with each movement. He gathered the few logs he had left, stacking them in a rough circle. His breath came out in clouds, his face stinging from the relentless wind, but his hands never stopped. He knew the drill. Build fast, build tight. The prairie would give no second chances. The shelter wasn't much. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was something. Jack laid logs against each other, stacking them high enough to keep the wind at bay. His tarp, pulled tight over the logs, would help keep the snow from drifting in. He could feel the wind whipping against him, but he kept going. The walls rose, one log at a time, as the storm raged harder. By the time the shelter was finished, the snow was thick, nearly blinding. Jack ducked inside, his breath heavy and labored. The cold bit at his face as he crouched down, but there was shelter, now rough, hasty shelter, but shelter all the same. The wind howled outside, but inside it was quieter. The storm's fury had become a distant roar, and Jack finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. The shelter wasn't perfect, but it would hold. For the night, at least. The cold was relentless. It gnawed at Jack Boone's bones, seeping through his coat, his layers of wool, and into the very marrow of his bones. The shelter he had, hastily thrown together, seemed inadequate, but it was all he had. The wind, shrieking outside, tore through the plains like a beast with no mercy. Jack could hear it whipping past the tarp, the logs creaking and groaning as if the earth itself were shifting beneath him. Inside, the shelter was quiet, but only just. The weight of the storm outside pressed in on him, making the space feel small and crowded. The fire he'd managed to get going crackled weakly, throwing off more smoke than warmth. He sat hunched by the flames, rubbing his hands together to coax some heat into his frozen fingers. The cold had settled deep within him, and no amount of fire seemed to reach it. Jack's eyes moved over the walls of his shelter. The logs were stacked roughly, uneven in places, but they held. They weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. The prairie was unforgiving, and perfection was a luxury that could kill a man out here. He had worked with what he had, using his hands and his experience to build something, anything that could protect him from the storm. His mind wandered, as it often did when he found himself in moments like this. He thought back to the first shelter he ever built, years ago, when he was green and foolish, thinking a few sticks of wood and a blanket could keep him safe from the harsh winter nights. Back then, he had learned quickly that the land didn't care about inexperience. It didn't care about mistakes. The prairie tested a man, and those who didn't learn fast paid the price. Jack remembered the stories of old-timers he'd heard in the saloons and around campfires. Stories of cowboys who had built their shelters with a kind of rough artistry, creating walls strong enough to hold off the bitter winds of the plains, roofs thick enough to withstand snowfalls that buried men alive. Some had used logs, some sod, others canvas. But the best shelters were built with knowledge of the land and the weather, of how the wind blew, and how the cold crept in where it wasn't expected. It had taken Jack years to understand the importance of shelter. But now, as he sat in this makeshift cabin, staring at the weak flame in front of him, he understood that it wasn't just about building for the night. It was about building for survival. Every decision, every choice had to be made with that in mind. There was no room for shortcuts. The fire flickered, and Jack poked at the embers with a stick, trying to get it to burn brighter. He knew that his shelter, though far from perfect, would hold. It would get him through the storm. The cold might bite, but it would not claim him, not tonight. The storm had settled into a steady howl, battering Jack Boone's shelter with a relentless fury. Inside, the cold seeped through the cracks in the logs and the gaps in the tarp, but it was better than being out there in the snow. The fire was little more than a glow now, struggling to stay alive. The warmth it offered was minimal, yet Jack clung to it, like the last thread of hope in a world that had gone cold. He sat hunched in the corner, staring into the low flames, his thoughts drifting like the snow outside. Alone? That's how it had always been out here. Alone, but not in the way most men thought. Some saw the frontier as a place of solitude, where you could escape from the world and find peace. But for Jack, solitude meant something else, something deeper. It was a companion, a constant presence that never left, even in the midst of chaos. The plains were unforgiving, and the men who survived them learned quickly that it was not the land itself that killed, it was the lack of respect for it. Jack's thoughts wandered to his past, to the days when he had first ridden the plains as a young man. He had been full of fire and ambition, eager to prove himself. Back then, it had been about the cattle, about the endless trails, about being a cowboy. But as the years wore on, something changed. It wasn't just about the cattle anymore. It was about surviving the land itself, about making it through one night, one winter, one storm at a time. The cattle came and went, but the land was always there, indifferent to who lived or died. The shelter he had built, though hastily thrown together, felt like a fortress now. It was nothing more than logs, canvas, and the will to live, but it had become a symbol of Jack's determination. It was a crude thing, but it had its purpose. And that purpose was survival. The cold continued to creep in, but it was no longer his greatest enemy. Outside, the storm raged, but Jack wasn't worried. He'd faced worse before. The wind, the cold, the silence, it was all part of the deal out here. The wilderness didn't owe you anything, and it didn't care if you were ready. It just was. And you either learned to live with it, or you died. Jack had learned to live with it. He stood, stretching his stiff legs and moving closer to the fire. The shelter wasn't much, but it would hold for the night. Tomorrow he would wake to the same winds, the same plains. But for now, in this moment, he was safe. The storm could rage all it wanted. He had made it through the worst of it, and that was all that mattered. The cold outside would continue, but Jack Boone had learned long ago that it was the ones who prepared for it that survived. He wasn't going anywhere tonight. The wind howled through the cracks in Jack Boone's shelter, a sound as old as the plains themselves. It was the kind of wind that spoke of danger, the kind that crept in from the north, carrying a cold that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. The fire had long since died down to embers, and the only light now came from the faint glow of the dying coals, casting long shadows against the walls. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the land, But inside, Jack was calm. The night before, a storm always felt like this, heavy, pregnant with something yet to come. It wasn't the fear of the storm itself. Jack had lived through enough of them to know that it was just another part of the land. It was the quiet that unsettled him, the silence that preceded the chaos. There was something unnerving about knowing what was coming and having no control over it. The plains had a way of making a man feel small, insignificant in the face of nature's fury. Jack pulled his coat tighter around himself, feeling the rough wool against his skin. The shelter was holding up, but barely. The tarp was beginning to flap in the wind, the logs shifting slightly with every gust. He had built this shelter quickly, with little more than his hands and his knowledge of the land. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. That was the thing about survival out here. It wasn't about perfection. It was about making do, adapting to the land instead of fighting it. He thought about the days before, when he had first come to these plains, eager to make his mark, back. Then he'd believed the stories, the tales of endless cattle drives, of men who tamed the land with their grit and determination. The truth, as Jack had learned, was different. The land didn't care about your grit. It didn't care about your plans or your ambitions. It was harsh, unyielding, and indifferent to human life. Jack's mind drifted back to a time when he had been told that speed was the key to survival. A man had to be quick, efficient, and relentless in his work. But in his time on the plains, Jack had learned that being too quick could be a man's downfall. He had watched too many men rush through their tasks, cutting corners, thinking they could outpace the land. The result was always the same: death by freezing cold or lack of preparation. He had learned to slow down, to think ahead. His shelter, though rudimentary, had been built with care, with the understanding that the land would test it. He had learned to build with what he had, to make the best of every takel's days. Resource. Tomorrow the storm would rage. Tonight, Jack knew that his shelter would hold. He had done what he could, and now it was time to wait. The wind would howl, the snow would fall, but he would survive. He always had. And as the night deepened, Jack Boone settled into the cold, knowing that the land could never take from him what he had learned to give it. The storm was unrelenting, the wind whistling through the cracks in the shelter, the snow piling higher against the walls. Jack Boone had done what he could. The shelter, rough and hastily constructed, was now his fortress. It wasn't much, just logs, canvas, and a fire that barely held on, but it was enough to get him through the night. For now, it was enough to survive. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and cold earth. Jack sat by the fire, his coat wrapped tightly around him, watching the flames dance weakly in the fire pit. The heat they offered was scant, and he hunched closer, feeling the cold gnaw at his bones. The storm outside was far worse than he had anticipated. The wind howled like an angry animal, rattling the walls of the shelter, pushing against the tarp that covered the roof. He could hear the snow striking the canvas in a steady rhythm, like the taps of 1,000 tiny hands. Despite the cold, Jack felt a strange sense of peace. It was a feeling he didn't often allow himself to have, peace amidst the storm. Out here, in the silence of the plains, there was no room for distractions, no one to call to, no one to judge. Just the land and the man, both testing each other in their own way. Jack's eyes turned to the walls of his shelter, the rough-hewn logs that stood as a testament to his patience and understanding of the land. He had built it in haste, true, but he had done it with purpose. Every log placed, every layer of canvas, was a choice born from experience. The shelter was sturdy, but not perfect. The prairie didn't demand perfection, it demanded survival. The cold outside was severe, but it was nothing Jack hadn't faced before. He knew the land like the back of his hand, the winds that swept across the plains, the snowstorms that could bury a man in hours, the temperatures that could freeze the life out of a body. He had learned long ago to respect the elements, and he'd learned the hard way that the land didn't care for your excuses. It took what it wanted. Jack let his mind wander back to a time when he had been younger, fresh to the plains, full of ambition and fire. Back then, he had believed that a man could bend the land to his will, that with enough strength and courage, the wilderness would submit. But as the years wore on, Jack had learned a different truth. Survival on the plains wasn't about conquering the land, it was about learning to live with it, to adapt, to respect it. The wind howled louder outside, but Jack remained still, watching the fire burn low. He had built this shelter with the knowledge that it might not last forever, but it would hold for tonight. And tonight, that was all that mattered. He closed his eyes for a moment, the cold creeping through his layers, but his thoughts were steady, grounded in the simple truth that out here, survival was a constant battle. And for tonight, at least, he had won. The storm raged on through the night, a fierce reminder of the plains' power over those who dared to live on it. Jack Boone sat by his fire, his back pressed against the shelter's rough log wall, feeling the heat from the embers warm his face. The night was long, and the winds were cruel, but he had faced worse before. The cold outside was biting, but Jack knew how to endure it. He had learned long ago that the plains didn't care for complaints, it didn't care for weakness. The land took what it wanted and gave only what it had to. Jack's eyes drifted to the canvas tarp above him. The wind beat against it, but it held firm, a testament to the work he had put in. The logs were solid, the construction simple but effective. The storm might rage outside, but inside, Jack was safe for now. His fire had dwindled down to little more than glowing embers, but he knew it wouldn't last the night. The last of his wood was nearly gone, and he couldn't afford to let the fire go out completely. A cold like this could freeze a man in his sleep, and that was something Jack could not afford. He stood, his joints stiff from hours of sitting in the cramped shelter, and stretched his legs. The night felt endless, each moment dragged down by the relentless wind. He moved to the small stack of firewood he had managed to collect earlier and added another log to the fire. The flames leapt briefly, casting a warm glow across the shelter before the wind outside howled louder, threatening to take it all away. As Jack squatted by the fire, his mind drifted. He thought about the old days, when the storms weren't so harsh, when the winters didn't bite with such a deadly force. Those were the days when the cattle still came, when the trails were still long and full of promise. But those days were gone. The world was changing, and Jack had learned to change with it, or else be left behind. The land was unforgiving, and it didn't give second chances. Every man who made it through the winter was one who had learned to adapt. Tonight, the storm was Jack's test, just like the land had tested him so many times before. He had built his shelter with the knowledge that it might not be enough. The canvas could tear, the logs could shift, the fire could go out, and the cold could take him. But Jack had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had learned to fight the cold, to fight the isolation, and to fight the fear that crept into his mind when the storm seemed like it would never end. He stepped back into the corner of the shelter and wrapped himself tighter in his coat. His eyes lingered on the fire for a moment, then he closed them, letting the warmth spread through him. Tomorrow he would face the storm again, but for now, tonight, he would sleep. The wind died down by the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a silence that felt as heavy as the snowdrifts outside. Jack Boone opened his eyes slowly, the quiet of the shelter broken only by the soft crackle of the last embers in the fire. The storm had passed, but the world outside remained buried in a thick layer of snow. The air was still, but Jack knew better than to trust the calm. The plains always had another surprise waiting. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff from the cold. The shelter had held through the night, but now the morning light revealed the damage the storm had caused. The tarp above him flapped weakly in the breeze, a few torn edges where the wind had tugged it mercilessly. The logs, though sturdy, had shifted slightly, the gaps in between them widening just enough to let in the cold. Jack's breath fogged in the air as he stood and stretched, feeling the ache in his limbs. He was tired, more tired than he had been in a long time, but there was no time to waste. The storm may have passed, but the day ahead was still waiting. He stepped outside, the cold biting at his skin as soon as he left the warmth of the shelter. The world was a blanket of white, the snow untouched by footprints, the prairie now a silent and endless expanse. Jack's boots crunched in the snow as he made his way around the shelter, assessing the damage. The wind had been fierce, but the shelter had stood its ground. The walls weren't perfect, but they had kept the worst of the storm at bay. Jack walked around the perimeter, checking the tarp, tightening the ropes that held it in place. The snow had piled up against the shelter, leaving a thick layer of white where the wind had driven it. He worked quickly, moving through the necessary repairs with the efficiency born of years of practice. He could feel the sting of the cold in his fingers, but it didn't slow him. Out here, there was no room for hesitation. After a while, he returned to the shelter, making sure the fire was lit again. It was small but steady, the heat spreading slowly into the cramped space. Jack leaned against the log wall, his back stiff from the cold, and took a moment to catch his breath. He had survived the storm. The worst was over, but there was still much to be done. The cattle were still miles away, and the journey back to the ranch would be long and difficult. But for now, the shelter had held. And for today, that was enough. He let the warmth of the fire seep into his bones, grateful for the simple survival that he had learned to embrace. The cold would return, the winds would howl again. But Jack Boone had learned long ago that survival wasn't about fighting the storm, it was about learning to live with it. The morning had brought clarity, but it didn't bring ease. Jack Boone stood outside his shelter, his breath misting in, the bitter cold, as he surveyed the wide, white expanse of the plains. The storm had passed, but the world had changed. Snowdrifts reached up to his knees, and the wind, though quieter now, still whispered across the open land, a constant reminder of nature's power. He felt small beneath the vast sky, and yet something about the endless stretch of the prairie made him feel grounded. Here it was just him and the land. And today the land had a challenge waiting. Jack had assumed, after surviving the storm, that his ordeal would be over. But the prairie had a way of testing a man when he least expected it. As he turned to check the logs around his shelter, something caught his eye tracks in the snow. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, the landscape shifting, but the tracks were unmistakable. They were large, heavy, made by something bigger than a deer, something dangerous. A bear, Jack thought. It didn't make sense. There was no sign of wildlife anywhere nearby. He had kept his distance from the deeper woods, knowing well enough that in winter a hungry bear would come looking for shelter, seeking warmth and food. But out here, on the plains, a bear wasn't supposed to be. Not in these conditions, not with the storm still fresh on the land. The tracks were fresh, and they were heading straight for his shelter. Jack's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't want to deal with this, not today, not after the storm. But the prairie didn't care what he wanted. It never did. He moved quickly but cautiously, following the tracks at a distance, keeping to the high ground, his senses sharp. His mind raced. Could the bear have been lured by the scent of the fire? Or had it just been wandering the plains, driven by hunger and desperation? The tracks led him further into the snow, and as he moved, Jack thought about the shelter he had built. It wasn't much a crude, hasty structure, but it was all he had. It had withstood the storm, yes, but would it withstand a bear? The thought settled in his gut like a heavy stone. The shelter was strong, but not strong enough to keep out something like that. The walls were solid, but the door was weak. It was nothing more than a simple piece of wood, fastened together with rope and nails. If the bear wanted in, it wouldn't be stopped by a flimsy door. He reached a rise in the land and paused, scanning the snow-covered horizon. The tracks were clearer now, leading directly toward the place where he had built his shelter. Jack gripped the rifle tighter, his eyes narrowing. This was a test he hadn't expected but couldn't afford to fail. The tracks led Jack Boone to the edge of the rise, where the snow had been undisturbed except for the large, deep marks of the bear's paws. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the trail, his mind calculating the next move. The cold gnawed at him, but it wasn't the cold he feared. It was what might be lurking behind the next snowbank, just out of sight. The bear had been close, very close, and the tracks led straight to the edge of his shelter. The sight of them made Jack's pulse quicken, his body tense with the knowledge that the storm had not been the only threat. The plains, for all their vastness, held dangers unseen, lurking beneath the ice and snow. The bear was just one more reminder of that. Jack had no choice but to return to his shelter. The thought of confronting the bear, of facing it in the open, felt like a gamble he wasn't ready to take. He wasn't certain how a bear might react to him, but he didn't want to find out, especially in these conditions. His shelter, however rough, was his only defense, and it was time to make sure it could withstand whatever the plains threw at him next. He walked back to his shelter, the snow crunching beneath his boots. His thoughts swirled around the situation. He hadn't built for bears, for predators that might find warmth in the very shelter meant to protect him from the cold. The walls were solid, the roof secure, but the door was a weakness. If the bear was hungry enough, it would tear through the weak wood, and Jack would have nowhere to hide. Inside the shelter, the fire still burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Jack stood by the door for a moment, weighing his options. He could reinforce the door with what he had, but it would take time, and time was something he didn't have in the face of a predator. He grabbed his rifle, checking it quickly, and set to work. There was no time to waste. If the bear came, he needed to be ready. Jack worked quickly, reinforcing the door with a few heavy logs he found near the shelter. He used the rope he had left to bind them to the frame, making it sturdier, more difficult for anything to break through. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. The bear, if it returned, would find a more formidable barrier. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, whistling through the cracks of the shelter. Jack tightened his coat and took a deep breath, the familiar cold sinking into his chest. He stood for a moment, listening. The storm had quieted, but the plains were still a dangerous place to be. The cold had returned, and Jack had learned long ago that the land never stopped testing him. He stepped back inside, taking one last look at the door. The shelter might hold, but only time would tell. The morning broke cold and still, the air so sharp it stung with every breath. Jack Boone stood outside his shelter, the sky above clear, but for the haze of the lingering storm clouds that still clung to the horizon. The snow had settled, but the plains were unchanged, vast and unforgiving. His shelter, though simple, had withstood the storm, the cold, and the potential threat of a bear. Jack didn't take pride in its survival. He only took solace in it. The land had tested him, and he had endured. The door, reinforced with logs and rope, held strong. The bear had never returned, but Jack knew the prairie well enough to understand that the danger wasn't over. Survival wasn't about a single victory. It was about staying ahead of the next test, the next challenge that the land would throw at him. Today, the challenge was the cold, which had settled deep into the earth and would remain until spring. Tomorrow, it might be something else. Jack's fingers ached from the cold, but the work had to be done. The firewood was running low, and there was little time to waste. He moved quickly, cutting the logs he had gathered, each strike of the axe reverberating through his muscles, each chunk of wood falling with a dull thud. The simple, repetitive work was familiar and comforting. It was the work that had kept him alive all these years, and it was the work that would continue to do so. He paused for a moment, standing over the logs, and looked around. The wind was quieter today, but it would return. The cold would return, and the prairie would continue to be what it had always been, harsh, demanding, and indifferent. But Jack had learned something in all his years out here. He had learned that survival wasn't about fighting the land, it was about understanding it, respecting it, and learning to live within it. He thought about the early days, when he had first arrived on the plains. Back then, he had been eager, full of ambition, and ready to conquer whatever the frontier threw his way. He had thought he could bend the land to his will. But the plains, like the rest of the wilderness, had no patience for ambition or pride. It didn't care about a man's plans or dreams. It cared only about survival. It cared about what a man could do, not what he thought he could do. Jack had learned the hard way. But he had learned, And now, standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. The cold would always return, the winds would always howl, and the land would always be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. But for tonight, Jack Boone had built something that had withstood it all. And in this world, that was enough. He turned and stepped back into the shelter, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Tomorrow he would face the plains again. But for now, he had earned his rest.